Good evening, and thank you for coming. It's incredible to see a packed house, and we've got some Baghdad experts in the audience tonight as well, Rajiv. So if you make any errors, you'll be picked up on them, I suspect. So great, thank you all for coming, and I think this evening's going to be really interesting. I don't know if all of you or some of you have had a chance to read the book yet. I have, obviously, and if you are thinking of spending £10 of your money for the hardback edition, I've only got the softback edition, it is actually an incredibly good read, as well as being a really, really fascinating account of life and administration in Baghdad during the crucial years just before and obviously through the invasion and afterwards. So welcome to Rajiv.
Thank you.
Chandrasekaran, who is now the associate editor of the Washington Post in DC, but of course was the Baghdad bureau chief for the same newspaper, of course, throughout that intense period. And fair to say the experiences that you reported on there are garnered together in this book to provide the account that we have. This week, Rajiv, just yesterday, or was it the day before, you won the day before, won the Samuel Johnson Award, coveted Samuel Johnson Award for non-fiction. I think it's coveted because actually there's money attached with it. I think that's one of the reasons why it's coveted. I don't know, I'm guessing. Which is a big award. It's a very big award to win, and congratulations on that. Just a little bit of bio about you, so you don't have to say it. Rajiv first visited Baghdad in September 2002. That was, of course, before the American-led invasion, and returned on frequent visits, and then took up post there as the full-time correspondent pretty much after the, very soon after the invasion happened. He, of course, has seen all the sort of periods that city went through, the first administration period through Jay Garner, remember him, we'll be talking about him in a moment. And then, of course, through Paul Bremer. We tend to call him Paul Bremer here, although, of course, in your book he's referred to his other name as well. And, of course, when the handover of power to what was then the interim government. So Rajiv was in Baghdad throughout the entire period, and the book really charts those 3 years, 2.5, 3 years?
Actually, 15 months.
15 months. It feels
longer.
It feels like 2.5 years, but especially for you, I imagine. But let's get stuck in to your book if we can. I think it's fair to say that it paints a pretty bleak picture of American-led administration after the war. You were based in Kuwait, as you were just telling me a few moments ago, watching the military campaign happen from the hotel lobby for those 3 weeks of the military campaign. At that moment, what were your thoughts about how things were going to play out after the military war was over?
Well, you know, I started to have my first grave reservations at that very time. The hotel that I was staying at, and many other journalists were at, it was the Hilton on the beach in Kuwait, a fairly posh little resort, was also home, was quickly discovered, to Jay Garner and many members of his initial reconstruction and governance team, known by the acronym ORHA. We'd run into these people in the dining room or in the hallways or by the swimming pool, and as we started to sort of seek some of them out, try to talk to them about what they were planning on doing once they got to Baghdad, it became quickly evident that here was a collection of people who really didn't have much of a plan. They had been thrown together, some who had just arrived days before we had, and they were all expecting a months-long military campaign, and so they'd have ample time to try to prepare something, and they all expected that they would only be going to Baghdad for a fairly short period of time because there would be a second wave of Americans who would have all the plans and all the materiel ready to go, and these guys were just going to be that sort of interim bridging staff. Well, how wrong they were and sort of how wrong we were, but it was from those early discussions. I had lunch one day with Barbara Bodine, who would be for a short period of time the sort of mayor of Baghdad, a former U.S. ambassador to Yemen. And instead of the lunch being me asking her all these questions about her plans, it very quickly turned into Barbara trying to download me about Baghdad, because I had been there for a few months and she hadn't been, nor had any of the other people. And they had some very basic questions about the city and what it was like. And I thought, this is bizarre. They'd be sort of asking me such sort of simple questions. Hadn't they bothered to read any of these stories? But apparently they hadn't.
Let's talk a bit about Jay Garner, because we remember him as a sort of affable, retired general. I remember the pictures of him, you know, wandering around the hotel foyers that you just described. Was he the right man for the job? I mean, how did he come to be appointed to that job?
Well, he was the right man for a certain job. It wasn't the actual job that materialized. He very quickly became a fall guy, and I think that he was unfairly blamed for broader failures in post-war planning at the Pentagon and across the Bush administration. Jay Garner was then a retired lieutenant general, a man who had distinguished himself by spearheading the humanitarian relief operation up in the Kurdish north after the 1991 Persian Gulf War. And so he was an expert in humanitarian relief. And that was what at least the Pentagon was expecting the initial wave of American civilian personnel would have to focus on. They were expecting that there would be widespread food shortages, a lack of clean drinking water, there would be a flow of refugees. In fact, many of the things that were expecting to happen then are actually happening today. But so Jay Garner's ORHA, the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, was divided into these three sort of subgroups, or three pillars. And one was in charge of humanitarian assistance, one was reconstruction, and the other was civil administration, actual sort of governance of the country. And the last component, they did very little on. They almost no planning. They had pre-positioned lots of food, lots of water and other medical supplies to be ready. And Garner, to his credit, did I think, a masterful job at preparing to deal with a humanitarian crisis. Well, that never unfolded. And unfortunately, fortunately, what the Americans had to contend with almost from day one was, how do you govern this country after the fall of Saddam? And he and his organization had done very little to plan for that. But part of the reason why they had done so little is they were told, you don't really need to worry about this. This will sort itself out. And it's my belief, and I argue this in the book, that part of this was intentional. That Doug Feith and others in the Pentagon that were very supportive of Ahmed Chalabi and other Iraqi exiles and wanted to see them essentially emerge as the new leaders of the country, they figured that the best way to engineer this would be to have Garner go in, sort of do his thing, but then, in that kind of post-war, not so much chaos, but in that environment, the Chalabi would rise to the surface. And so he would sort of organically become the chief among the exiles who would be running the place, and that Garner really wouldn't need to do all that very much, and didn't need to have a very detailed political plan. This is why, for instance, the de-Baathification order that was being written up in Feith's office, why didn't Feith give it to Garner to implement right away instead of giving it to Bremer?
I was interested in terms of what Jay Garner was told and what he wasn't told, because it's become a kind of a modern-day political mantra that there was no post-war plan for Iraq. And we've just seen this week Tony Blair in his last week in office, many would say primarily leaving office perhaps earlier than he would have liked, because of the morass of Iraq and the fact that perhaps there wasn't a well-worked-out plan. But one of the interesting things in your book, actually, where you detail that, in fact, the State Department had been working on a very detailed plan about what to do with post-conflict Iraq. It's just that no one had told Jay Garner about it.
Indeed. It was voluminous, the Future of Iraq project that involved a number of State Department officials working with literally dozens of Iraqis in exile, looking at things ranging from the governance of post-war Iraq to electricity and basic public services to culture to the future of the army. The sum total of the reports totaled more than 2,000 pages.
So
never
go figure.
Pentagon.
I mean, how can we explain that?
Well, you know, an easy way to explain it is, evil Pentagon, it didn't like State Department, didn't show it to Garner. The actual fact of the matter is more complicated than that. And not to get too wonky here, but in the most important working group for the Future of Iraq project, the governance group, Ahmed Chalabi's allies had managed to essentially hijack this group, and they had two meetings, one in Surrey and one in another one, forgive my lack of knowledge of the English countryside, but in another sort of bucolic location in your country. Wilton Park and Cobham, I think, were the two places. And the Chalabi partisans had managed to sort of hijack this and to get this report to essentially call for the formation of a government in exile, which is something the State Department did not favor. So as a result, the State Department essentially tried to bury this report. So it didn't really sort of try to pass it on to the Pentagon because it worried that it would be essentially passing on something that was favorable to what the Chalabi guys wanted. So it's not fair to entirely blame the Pentagon for not embracing this. The guys at State didn't really do their part to help tout it.
Now, one of the other themes that you spend quite a lot of time on the book, which I think is fascinating to a UK audience where our political system is very different from the US administration in terms of the level of, the depth of, if you like, of political appointees, the way that all, or many jobs in government, or even loosely associated government, cut down into the party political system. Whereas even in the UK now, we do have the vestiges of an impartial civil service. And you deal a lot with the type of people who were appointed in Jay Garner's administration and, of course, in Paul Bremner's administration. And the people that were chosen, really by any reckoning, were an odd collection of people. The Arabists, the people who had expertise, the people who had experience of the Middle East, the people who had experience of post-conflict situations, they were kind of left on the sidelines.
They were. You would think, given the challenges of reconstructing and governing post-Saddam Iraq, the United States government would have sent its best and brightest. You know, people with Arabic language skills, some experience in post-conflict nation building, some time spent in the Middle East. But what seemed to be more important to the Bush White House in many cases, and to the Pentagon, was, instead of subject matter expertise, was political fidelity. So instead of trolling the ranks of the State Department or NGOs in the United States for the right people, those doing the hiring instead turned to Republican offices on Capitol Hill, conservative think tanks in Washington and elsewhere, and other corners of the Bush administration. And then, as I write in the book, just to make sure they got the right people, they subjected them to some fairly blunt questioning at the Pentagon. You know, people were asked questions like, are you a member of the Republican Party? Did you vote for George W. Bush in the 2000 election? And some people have said they were even asked for their views on subjects such as abortion and capital punishment. Now, you might ask, why would they do this? It doesn't seem, on its face, is so bizarre. And there are a couple of explanations. One is, when I first heard about this, and this would be back in the late spring of 2005, and it's important because this is before Hurricane Katrina, I reacted with utter disbelief. I didn't think this could be true. And then, then we heard about Katrina and Michael Brown at FEMA, the Arabian horse expert hired to lead America's emergency management agency. And more recently, as many of you I'm sure have heard about, this whole U.S. attorneys saga with political litmus tests being used for the hiring and retention of U.S. attorneys and prosecutors around the country. And so this fits into sort of a broader pathology for or a modus operandi, shall I say, for the Bush administration, whereby political loyalty is an important criteria for being hired for various jobs, not just in Baghdad, but across the government. That's one. Another explanation is that the people in charge of this, senior people in the Bush administration, simply expected this to be sort of a walk in the park. You know, we toppled their army and conquered Baghdad in 3 weeks. This reconstruction thing should be fairly easy. So we will, you know, this will be a chance to simply stamp the CVs of a bunch of loyal young Republicans. And so it was going to just simply be a resume burnishing endeavor. And so as a result, let's bring on the loyalists as opposed to bringing on people who might, you know, be critical of this and might perhaps give interviews to people at the Washington Post saying bad things about the reconstruction effort.
In fact, you label them, or they were labeled as the Brat Pack, because a number of these people were, apart from being the right colour, if you like, in terms of their political persuasion, were incredibly young. I mean, these are guys out of university whose first job was to run a £10 billion infrastructure project when we get to the days of the CPA and Paul Bremer's administration.
We sent a 24-year-old kid who had never worked in finance out to reopen Baghdad Stock Exchange. We sent a 21-year-old guy who hadn't even graduated from university over to work with a team of Americans trying to rehabilitate the Interior Ministry. I don't think I need to tell anybody what an important job rehabilitating the Interior Ministry is. This guy boasted to an interviewer that his most meaningful job before going to Baghdad was as an ice cream truck driver. My personal favorite, though, was what happened in healthcare. You know, when I was in Kuwait, the U.S. Agency for International Development sent one of its top officials out to Kuwait to work with Jay Garner's team to take charge of rebuilding Iraq's healthcare system. And this guy was eminently qualified. His name was Skip Burkle, and he was a physician. He had a master's degree in public health. He taught post-conflict public health care reconstruction at one of America's leading universities. The guy had 4 postgraduate degrees, Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, and Berkeley. He had worked in Kosovo and Somalia and northern Iraq after the '91 Gulf War. He was a naval reservist with 2 Bronze Stars. I mean, a USAID colleague has called this guy the single most talented post-conflict public health expert working for the U.S. government. A week after Baghdad's liberation, he was told to pack his bags and come home. A very senior official at USAID, and I've seen this email, sent him a note saying that the White House had decided it wanted a quote-unquote loyalist in the job. As I write in the book, Skip Burkle has a wall full of degrees, but he doesn't have a picture with the president. In his place, who was sent? A guy by the name of Jim Haveman. Jim Haveman was a 60-year-old social worker. He wasn't a physician. He wasn't a post-conflict public health expert. He didn't have a lot of international experience, but he was a loyal Republican. He worked as the community health director in the state of Michigan, and his boss, former boss, the former Republican governor of that state, recommended him to Paul Wolfowitz, who got him out to Baghdad. This guy's sole international experience prior to Iraq was as the director of a faith-based non-governmental organization that promoted Christianity in the developing world. Before his stint in government, he worked for an adoption agency that counseled pregnant women not to have abortions, so he had the right political views. When he got to Baghdad, one of his projects involved mounting an anti-smoking campaign.
Yeah. That's, yeah. That's a good anecdote. I want to drill down into the Bremner days in more detail in a moment. But you don't know I'm going to do this to you, but I want you to read an extract from your own book. It sort of rounds off nicely this sort of issue of who was sent and the issue of their experience and their worldliness, if you like. You'll recognize the section here. I've marked it for you because I think it's just quite
yes. I love this one.
It's quite revealing and it ends on a good punchline. So over to you, Rajiv.
Munzer Fatfat, an American citizen of Lebanese descent who applied to be the senior advisor to the Ministry of Youth and Sport, told me he was asked during his interview at the White House liaison's office, this at the Pentagon, the people doing the hiring, if he was a Republican or a Democrat. When he replied that he was a registered Democrat, he was asked for whom he had voted in the 2000 presidential election. I avoided the question, Fatfat said. Fatfat, who was a Muslim, was then asked about his religion. Quote, I told him I was a Muslim, but I'm married to a Christian. My children go to Catholic schools. I went to a Catholic school, he said. Fatfat had a doctorate in youth policy studies. He'd worked for the United Nations for 4 years as the Minister of Youth and Sport in Kosovo. He also had the support of a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania. In the end, he got the job, but he was subjected to 5 separate interviews at the Pentagon. Most staffers just had 1. When he arrived in Baghdad, his faith once again became an issue. Quote, One of Bremer's top aides asked me what my religion was. When I answered, he was surprised. "Oh, you're a Muslim," he said. "But you're not like a terrorist, are you?"
That's another good anecdote. The book is full of good anecdotes like that. Now let's talk a bit about the Paul Bremer days, because clearly they were incredibly important. We've talked a bit about Jay Garner. After a few weeks, really, he was moved aside. And Washington realized that there was a bigger job that needed to be done, and Jay Garner, obviously an assessment was made that he wasn't the man to do it, and Paul Bremer was. Now, in your book, you mentioned, I think it must have been a photo op or a facility. Anyway, you were with him, touring around Baghdad, and obviously filing a story on it. And you recount, actually, that in those early days, he made quite an impression on you, a positive impression, in fact.
He did, and that's a very good point. I didn't start out as one of these people who thought Bremer was an idiot, who thought he was a wrong man for the job. When Bremer came in, and remember, this man is a distinguished American diplomat, been an American ambassador, senior positions at the State Department, worked in the private sector. You know, I thought this was going to be the sort of dynamic, take charge sort of individual who could really help right this foundering reconstruction and governance enterprise. And I thought, all right, well, he's going to come here, he's going to listen to Iraqis, he'll work with the Iraqis, and collaboratively, something good will come out of this. And, you know, Bremer talked with great ambition. He wanted America to be as ambitious in Iraq as it was in Germany and Japan after World War II, with reconstruction, with sort of moving forward with democratic governance. And I thought, and some might accuse me of being a tad naive, but I genuinely thought that you know, this guy could pull it off. And as things progressed, you know, I of course became more disillusioned and disappointed in what he did. But my arc of the view of my personal view of Bremer, you know, really, you know, began on a fairly high note.
I mean, we'll talk about his bad calls, if you like. You mentioned one already, the de-Baathification process, in a moment. But I guess we have the perception that the international donor conferences, the amount of money, particularly the US, has poured into the military, but also the sort of civil side of post-conflict Iraq, is a huge amount of money. It's billions and billions and billions of dollars.
More than $20 billion.
And yet in your book, when you nail down, as you do in great detail, to the individual ministries that are trying to get back on their feet again, you realize that the amount of money that the individual ministries had to play with and the amount of staff they had for the job that was in hand, which was a huge job by anyone's reckoning, really wasn't sufficient. I mean, just to continue this sort of positive theme about Paul Bremer's coalition provisional authority, do you think that he had, at the beginning, enough tools for the job?
He certainly didn't. You know, he didn't have enough staff, and there weren't enough troops on the ground to secure the country. So if that's the case, then your ambition has to be commensurate with your resources. If you don't have the personnel right away, then don't go about trying to rebuild the country bolt by bolt. But, you know, in some senses, that was one of his biggest mistakes. He sought to do too much when he didn't have the people, both on the civilian or the military side, to do so.
And I guess, actually, that's echoed in the title of your book. Of course, it's called The Emerald City, Life in the Green Zone. And I guess one of the reasons why they tried to bite off more than they could chew was they didn't really have a proper appreciation of what Iraq was really like outside of the Green Zone. Indeed.
And before I get to that, you know, Bremer and his people, you know, I don't ascribe to these conspiracy theories that, you know, they were out there to rape and pillage the country, or that they deliberately wanted to hobble Iraq. I think they all came with the best of intentions. And they came with the utmost of American earnestness. You know, they wanted to build that shining city on a hill. They wanted to create a country that would have transformative powers across the Middle East. And they felt, you know, these Americans felt that, you know, we've got the best democratic system, the best economic system on the face of the earth, and so what Iraq needs is a Jeffersonian democracy, and we're going to build that in the heart of the Middle East. And they need a vibrant free market like we have in America. And so they came with those sort of biases. And obviously, as we know so well now, you know, while Iraqis want democracy, they want it on their own terms, and it has to generate organically, develop organically, as with so much else. It can't just be imposed from the outside. But, you know, what exacerbated this was the wacky world of the Green Zone. And I devote a lot of time to writing about the absurdities of the Green Zone. But and we can talk a little bit about that. I'm sure many of you have had some exposure or heard about that. But I don't just write about it for the sake of amusement. I mean, while it is endlessly amusing, it had a real practical impact. You had these Americans who showed up there with the best of intentions, perhaps not great experts in the Middle East, but accomplished in their own ways in some cases. They weren't all, you know, 25-year-old political hacks. Some of them, you know, had years of experience. But they quickly became ensconced in this place. And back then, while it was safe enough to travel about, they didn't do so that much. They kind of lived and worked inside their bubble, a bubble that had 24 hours a day electricity, was air conditioned, they had plenty of food and water. And after a while in this environment, you start to think, well, the rest of Iraq is sort of like this. And then, you know, they interacted with a small group of Iraqis who were their translators, who were the sort of support and administrative personnel inside the Green Zone. And those Iraqis knew that they had some of the best jobs in the country. And they were petrified of sort of offending their American bosses by speaking the sort of blunt truth to them. So they sort of told their bosses what they thought their bosses would want to hear. It was a classic case of the emperor has no clothes. So you'd have the Americans sort of talking about, how should we fix the school system? And they'd sit in a conference room and diagram things on a whiteboard, and they'd have some Iraqis in there, and the Iraqis would sort of affirm what the Americans were thinking instead of making clear to them what was really going on the ground. And so as a result, you had these sort of policies, you know, come out of the Green Zone that were oddly detached. And you had Americans who sat in the Green Zone thinking that Iraq needed A when it needed B. You know, best example, a country where unemployment was somewhere between 40 and 60%. What Iraq needed was a jobs program. You know, hire these disaffected young men to pick up the trash on the street, to rebuild the looted ministry buildings. Instead, what the first wave of economic advisors started to do was rewrite Iraq's tax code. Went through it line by line, writing the tax code. In fact, they gave Iraq a dream of the American neoconservatives, a 15% flat tax. Hey, if you're seeking tax relief, move to Baghdad.
Let's... Yeah, maybe not. Let's talk a bit about then some of the mistakes which have been adjudged mistakes by you and by others in the years since Bremer left and power was handed over first to the interim government. I guess the de-Baathification decision was an incredibly big decision, and now is adjudged to have been a mistake in many ways, because it severed off a lot of people who could have made a positive contribution to rebuilding the country from doing so. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? And you could see in those days, back then, that actually the idea of excluding those people who'd been integral to Saddam's regime kind of made some sense. Why do you think that perhaps wasn't explored a bit further and people hadn't thought it through quite as much as perhaps now we think they should have done?
They did. The night before Bremer was to issue his de-Baathification order, he briefed senior members of the Coalition Provisional Authority, many of whom, because this was early days, were people who'd come with Garner. And what he heard was near universal opposition. When Jay Garner heard about this, Jay was still in Baghdad, he went over and grabbed the CIA station chief, and they marched into Bremer's office and said, you shouldn't do this. The CIA station chief said, you're going to send 30 to 50,000 people underground by nightfall. The senior advisors to a variety of Iraqi ministries said, you know, this is a grave mistake, and Bremer wouldn't hear about it. This policy had been cooked up in Doug Feith's office. Bremer was sort of told he should implement it, and Bremer got behind it and embraced it, and thought it was a great idea, and was not willing to listen to his own people. There was plenty of opposition inside the Green Zone back then. It was blown off.
The parallel was made, wasn't it, for when those people who were arguing for that process to continue to the sort of purge of the Nazis, if you like, after World War II. And that's a very, whenever you use imagery like that, it's a very powerful set of images to use with any political process. But that was misplaced, wasn't it, really? It wasn't a correlation at all.
It was misplaced, but it was, that whole argument was perpetuated brilliantly by Ahmed Chalabi in the Iraqi National Congress, which wrote a paper proposing that de-Baathification be modeled after the need for denazification. It was a paper circulated within conservative circles in Washington in the run-up to the war, and became something that, an impetus for Doug Feith's office to move forward with the de-Baathification order.
So let's move on to another bad call, if you like, and that is the disbanding of the military. I want to challenge you a bit on this, because again, this is another received wisdom now that, of course, disbanding the army was a very bad idea, because, of course, they could have been retasked and rebadged and, hey, you've got a ready-made army. But as General Caldwell, who's the current Iraqi spokesman, says very frequently, those guys did just sort of melt away. The army wasn't really there to be retasked. Was that an error that could have been avoided, or do you think that's unfair criticism?
I'm going to be a little nuanced here. The old Iraqi army, you know, could not have been called back wholesale and turned into the new national army, and all would have been fine, and we could have sort of said, the job is done. It was a dysfunctional army. It was bloated with way too many generals. It was a Sunni-led army with a bunch of Shiite conscripts. It had to be radically overhauled. The question is how. And also on de-Baathification, I'm not arguing that there should have been no de-Baathification. You always needed to go after the top level, the real cronies, the people with blood on their hands. With de-Baathification, the problem was it went too far. It caught up a lot of people that shouldn't have been caught up. So you needed a narrower policy of de-Baathification. With the army, what you needed, the problem was that the people who wanted to continue on in the army, they weren't treated with any basic respect. I'm not saying you should have just called them all back and said, all right, you're the new army, but they could have been called back. Those who wanted to come back could have come back. They could have been registered. Then they could have been all given some sort of pension, which was done belatedly, but it took a time it took many demonstrations in Baghdad before Bremer and company realized they had made a grave mistake. You know, had the army been sort of, at least, because the army was always perceived as a national institution, not as a Saddamist institution. Saddam used other apparati, his mukhabarat, his istikbarat, the Special Republican Guard. Those were the tools of his terror. The General Army, many of them were just a bunch of chumps looking, you know, for a paycheck. But they had some broad respect in the country, and if they had been a more sort of a systematic approach in trying to catalog these people, offering to pay them some sort of statement of respect for their national service, it would have gone down much better. And that's what needed to be done. And then those that were determined to be worthy of inclusion in the new army could well have been given some retraining, that sort of thing. But I don't argue that all those units should have just been sort of called back and said, you're the new army, go to it.
Well, now, just remind me, where are we in the timeline now? We're disbanding the military, we've had the de-Baathification process. Where are we in 2003?
We're sort of in mid-June 2003 at this point.
2003. So, as all these things were happening, another thing was happening, and that is that the insurgency was beginning, really. Join together some dots for us then about how the events that we've been talking about led to some of the insurgency.
I need to add one more element in this timeline, and I think this is a late May 2003 dot, and that is when the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom went to New York to the UN Security Council and asked, I think this was now resolution either 1483 or 1511, asked for the formal authority from the Security Council to be the occupying power in Iraq. And, prior to that, the Americans and the Brits weren't greeted with flowers and sweets, as some Iraqis might have, as some Iraqi exiles had predicted. But I did see young boys hand cans of Pepsi to soldiers. The Iraqis were truly grateful to be free of Saddam. They were happy to be liberated. There was ample goodwill, political capital for the Brits and the Americans at that time. Debathification, the dissolution of the military, chipped away at that. One of the most one of the biggest blows to that gratitude came from this resolution because, as we know so well, the term occupation has such negative connotations in that part of the world. And all of a sudden, almost overnight, we went from beloved liberators to despised occupiers. It was a huge blow, and it really materially influenced perceptions. And, there were plenty of ways, at least I believe, the United States could have, and its coalition partners, could have exercised influence and authority in Iraq without formally telling the people of Iraq, we are your occupying power. It really set things back.
And at this moment we have both insurgencies, if you like, rising. The Sunni-led insurgency, many military officers, not of a very senior rank, but of middle rank, who you describe in your book, who, because they could no longer earn a living in the military and were excluded from economic opportunities that you also describe, decided that actually, along with the occupying force, that they would sort of take up violence.
Yep.
And at the same time, we were also seeing the rise of the militias in the Shiite
I think that actually took a little bit more time. There were always these Shiite militias. They had formed in many cases during the Saddam years as some of them mounting cross-border attacks from Iran, others as simply a response to the persecution of the Shiites post-1991. But the Shiite militias, some of them, when they kicked off in the summer of '03, they were actually more a response to the rampant lawlessness that was occurring in Baghdad. The fact that there was so much street crime and what would become the Mahdi army kind of coalesced in Sadr City as a way to protect institutions. I mean, Kindi Hospital, the large public hospital near Sadr City, was largely protected from looters by young Shiite gunmen who were sort of, we later called them members of the Mahdi army. They said we're loyal to the Hausa, the religious community down in Najaf. And so, but I think that the Shiite activity was largely, was not sort of a versus Sunni at that point. It was just simply kind of public order and protection of Shiite communities. The Sunni insurgency was kicking off as I think a direct response to the American decisions to really marginalize the Sunni community, and that was the real deleterious impact of the debathification decision, the decision to disband the army, and the way the governing council was formed. It sent a really unambiguous message to the Sunni community that you really have no place in the future of Iraq, that you're going to be real second-class citizens. And as a result, I think it pushed people into what would become the insurgency. And using ample resources that had been looted from the government and just resources that many of these people had. And then what I think is then sort of kicked off the civil war, just sort of zooming ahead real quickly, was actually Zarqawi and the Al-Qaeda affiliated, the Salafist Wahhabist types. If there's anybody in this whole Iraq adventure over the past 4 years who's actually been able to execute a coherent plan, it was Zarqawi. And Zarqawi essentially co-opted the indigenous ex-Ba'athist, more Arab nationalist resistance that was focused largely on attacking U.S. and other coalition forces. and co-opted them into this more radical Wahhabist approach of going after Shiite civilians and you know, helped to radicalize Iraq's Sunni population, to see those Shiites as sort of occupying the same rung of hell as Western infidels. And so then you get the sort of rise of suicide bombings, not just targeting Western institutions and American forces, but targeting Shiite civilians. And as a result, the Shiite militias, which were, you know, at sort of a small level, primarily focused on sort of guarding Shiite areas, they start sort of gathering momentum as a response to protect Shiite civilians and Shiite communities, and that sort of kicks off then this sort of retaliatory tit-for-tat cycle of violence.
I was really fascinated by that bit of the book where you talk about the early, the visible splintering of the Sunni and the Shia communities, because I know, you know, from my time in Iraq, which was primarily 97 to 2000, it was true to say that Iraq, you felt in Iraq that you were living in a secular country, and that the divisions of Sunni and Shia were much more submerged there than in many other Arab countries, and that was rather pleasant. And yet we talked about how Zarqawi, of course, contributed to that, but even one thing I was struck by, I found surprising, was when you talk about how the governing council was set up, which was the authority that was, if you like, the first emergings of democracy in Iraq, if you like. And you describe how, when it was drawn up, it was drawn up along ethnic and sect lines.
Yes.
And you argue in your book that, in fact, that almost highlighted divisions that perhaps would better have been left below the surface.
Indeed. You know, in Iraq, there was both historical tension between Sunnis and Shia, like there are throughout the broader Muslim world. But there was also a remarkable degree of coexistence, of comity. You know, there are more Sunni-Shia mixed marriages in Iraq than in any other Arab Muslim country. Sunnis and Shia lived next door to each other. Iraq, under its Ba'athist government, was a secular, modern state. I'm not trying to excuse the Ba'athists, but there was this sort of, there was a real emphasis on secularism. But there were these sort of tensions that existed, particularly after the 1991 war, when the Shiite communities rose up in rebellion. Saddam, who had been had taken a softer line toward the Shiites prior to that, tensions really did escalate. So you were dealing with something of a tinderbox, and particularly exacerbated also by the fact that the main exile groups were either Shiite or Kurdish. There were very few Sunni Arabs in the exile community, and the Americans and the others were working largely with the Shiite Arab community as well as the Kurdish community. So it was a very fragile situation, and I think it could have gone either way. And I think that had the Americans had a better understanding of this and sought to manage it, I think that they could have tried to minimize some of this tension. But instead, you know, the Bush administration, which so loathes quotas and affirmative action in parts of domestic American life, was very quick to embrace a quota system for the formation of the governing council. You know, there's going to be 13 Shia Arabs, 10 Sunni Arabs, or 5 Sunni Arabs, 5 Kurds, an Assyrian, a Turkmen, a communist, to make up the 25-member governing council. And it sent this message to the Iraqis very clearly that now, from this point on, sect and ethnicity matter in terms of your political representation. And I'm not trying to blame the Civil War on Bremer and those decisions, but I think things like the formation of the governing council exacerbated tensions instead of trying to send a message to the Iraqis that we're trying to establish a real big tent here.
Okay, we're going to take some questions quite shortly, and I'm going to skip a little bit of history now because I'm keen to ask you about the present. You're now based in DC. You're watching these events play out, as we all are, from a bit more of a distance than perhaps was once the case. and we're in the middle of, I think, an intensely interesting process led by General Petraeus, the surge policy, which has been described perhaps rightly as the last roll of the dice for American policy in Iraq. And as I understand the timeline for that, although no doubt you will know better than me, he'll present his assessment, his own assessment, in September to the Senate about whether or not that surge policy has been effective in reducing the awful level of violence to perhaps a more acceptable level of violence, whatever that is. How do you think we're going on that?
Well, if only I was privy to all this classified information. But look, my sense is that the surge may very well end up being tactically successful. I think that Petraeus is a smart fellow, and I think that given the infusion of troops, will he be able to improve security in some neighborhoods in Baghdad? I think he can. I think he already has, and I think he can. But that's not the entirety of the surge. The surge involves, let's break it down, 3 components. It's using these troops to improve security so that you create an environment whereby the political elites, the Iraqi political elites, who are now ensconced in the Green Zone, much like Bremer was, move forward with political compromise and national reconciliation. And then as a third step, ordinary Iraqis look to their political elites who have compromised and say, aha, let us put some support behind this government, put down our weapons, and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Now, I don't mean to be flip about this, but while I think the first part may have some chance of working, I think the odds of actually getting the political elites to come to meaningful compromise, and that compromise to have any material impact on the overall national situation, I think that's very remote. The chances are very, very slim.
So let's say it's remote. Let's say it's remote, and Petraeus says that it's been exactly as you describe. It's been effective in the sense that it's reduced the, and I know that they have the data, I've seen the charts, they very proudly will show you the bar charts of, you know, it's only like 400 dead, and last month it was 500 dead, and they have it all plotted out. Say on those bar charts it is effective, but say also that you're correct in saying that the political process behind it hasn't happened. What happens next? Well, as far as U.S. policy, U.S. commitment in Iraq?
I think that the Democrats huff and puff. The Republicans grudgingly give this a little bit more time, but strike a sort of backroom deal that involves the drawdown of a significant number of American forces, let's say by half, starting in the spring of 2008. So that as the Republican National Convention is underway and Americans start to think about who they want to vote for president, the images that dominate are of American troops returning home, and that it does not disadvantage Republican presidential candidates. But the pressure that Bush is going to be under is not going to be from the Democrats, it's going to be from his fellow Republicans who believe that the current policy is untenable for them as they head into the elections in November. And so I think we'll start to see movement, and the White House has already telegraphed that this may well happen. But we're not going to see a drawdown to zero. I think we'll still have tens of thousands of Americans in country, some protecting the Green Zone, others in bases, and then this problem falls into the lap of whoever inherits the White House in January 2009.
And just before we take questions, let's just explore that point a bit more. How do you see the issue of Iraq playing out in terms of the 2008 presidential election? In terms of, one, who the Republicans will choose to be the candidate. You're a Washington insider, you live out in the Beltway now, and how the Democrats will respond to it as well.
If only I knew. Before I answer that, I just want to make one additional sort of amplification to what I was saying earlier in the political context. You know, the Democrats, I think at the end of the day, despite their huffing and puffing, that you know, in trying to impose a timeline and a troop withdrawal, at the end of the day, I don't think the Democratic leadership really wants that. I'm going to be real cynical for a second here and say that at the end of the day, they want Americans to head to the polls in November 2008, voting with George Bush's Iraq war policy there, not a Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid policy, which, you know, it will still involve chaos in Iraq and dead Americans. And, you know, at the end of the day, they don't want to be tarred with this. They want it to be in Bush's hands. You know, I thought that McCain made a brilliant argument that more troops should be sent until the day Bush decided to send more troops. Because it's a great thing to appeal to the Republican base. If only we had tried harder, we could have won this. Well, now that they've actually done it, I think it really does pull the rug out from under McCain. And it leaves the Republicans you know, facing a fairly difficult challenge in trying to, you know, with the background of the surge, justify their support for the war and the outcome, and it puts them in a box. But the Democrats are in the same one. You know, the we shouldn't have gone to war argument will resonate for the Democratic base. But once the Democratic convention is over and they're appealing to the general electorate, that ain't going to work. And so the Democratic candidate, the Democratic nominee, is going to have to find a message that pushes forward. And you know, the Democratic challenge is going to be, you know, if they call for full withdrawal, how do they respond to the criticism that it's going to turn into an even bigger civil war and a more overt proxy war involving Iran, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Jordan, and have massive spillover consequences in the region? And the Democratic candidates have not had to really address that in a way, but they will have to do so in the run-up to the general election. And so that's going to be an interesting, you know, it's hard to know who the nominee is going to be so early on, but I think both sides will be facing a real challenge here with Iraq. And in Iraq will continue to be the dominant subject of discussion in 2008 in the campaign.
Great. Okay. Well, listen. Let's open up. There's a lot of people here who know Iraq very well. You, sir, you've been very quick with your hand there. Let's have the first question. We'll just wait for the microphone to come over.
I want to ask Rajiv and my friend from Sky. Both the Anglo-American media has been extremely servile to the mechanism of Bush and Blair. I cannot for life of me understand the lies and deception that have been practiced and the failure of media, you see, barring the Guardian or the Independent. Most of them were taken for ride, even a legislature like the British Parliament, you see, were full of eunuchs by few, were taken for ride. So I'd like to ask the question that these medias are owned by corporates, you see, and they are interested in power, and they are interested to support the people in power. For instance, Blair relies on Sun newspaper to see that whether, you see, Murdoch is happy or not as such. So the second question I want to ask is, and this was raised by Avi Salam, the Israeli academic from Oxford, that the entire enterprise of war in Iraq was to weaken, you see, the Palestinian and to help the Israelis and to, you see, show to the Iranians and Syrians that they cannot raise their faces as such. Okay,
good question. That's quite a big second question. Let's deal with the first one first, which is we were taken for a ride. You personally were taken for a ride, and you work for an organization that could have pointed out the mistakes more. What about that?
Well, you know, I'd like to note that my organization did. You know, my colleagues, particularly Walter Pincus, did a very aggressive job at trying to debunk some of the claims being made. Part of the problem was that my newspaper unfortunately played a lot of his best stories on page A19 as opposed to page A1.
A19 is a good page, actually. Right? I like
yes, as somebody who's an inhabitant of that page, I must say I like that real estate. But you know, look, did the media in the United States and in Britain fall down on the job? Yeah, we did. I'm not going to make any excuses for the pre-war reporting. We all could and should have been more aggressive. You know, part of it is, and again, this is going to sound a little naive to some of you in the crowd, but you know, there was this presumption, at least before the Iraq invasion, that when government officials told you that this is what the intelligence said, that they were speaking of, this was not politicized, that this was, you know, this was what the intelligence showed, and then there was a discussion about the policy that you would engage in based on that intelligence. Now we know, how intelligence can be politicized, but should we have expected that? Yes, but I think that we were sort of operating under certain presumptions, and we shouldn't have. But I think that after that point, I think that the reporting has been very aggressive. And I think that both in the United States and the United Kingdom, journalists have covered Iraq thoroughly and aggressively and at personal risk. And I don't think, at least in the last 3.5 years, reporters have been the toadies of either the Bush or the Blair administration, reporters covering Iraq.
Good first question. Let's have the second one. Sir, right at the very back. Sorry, giving you a very long way to walk. Maybe you should throw the microphone or something.
Thanks. I wonder, a corollary to that last question, do you think we're getting the right impression now about it being a civil war? I think the figure is 80% of attacks are actually attacks against occupying troops rather than intra-Muslim attacks. Do you think we're getting the right impression? And secondly, Iraq is currently exporting millions of dollars of barrels worth of oil, millions of dollars worth. Where is that money going?
It's a good question. An awful lot of the Iraqi oil is being lost to corruption, smuggling, enormous proportion of it, largely because the pipeline to the north has been repeatedly blown up, so it's trucked out, and trucks often go astray, and oil out of the south often gets loaded on to tankers that sometimes are barges that go off to mysterious destinations. And the amount of oil that Iraq is producing is well below what it could be producing. If Iraq was able to pass a hydrocarbon law with all the relevant annexes, despite the violence, multinational oil companies would come into Iraq. They operate under equally dangerous situations in another part of the world, and you get some meaningful exploration, and also some real investment in the actual just the oil pumping apparatus, which is old and decrepit, and would actually start to hopefully inject some more meaningful revenue into the Iraqi national treasury. The first question, just real quickly.
Civil war.
Civil war, yeah. Look, are the bulk of attacks directed against foreign forces in Iraq? Yes. But are there, well, the bulk of the sort of the reported attacks, but who's reporting, who's compiling all of the cases where militiamen show up in somebody's neighborhood, pull out somebody and shoot them in the head, or all the cases where people are abducted at checkpoints? There's no comprehensive reporting on all the violent incidents that occur in Iraq on any given day. And suffice to say, you have I don't want to get into a semantic debate about does it qualify as a civil war based on the commonly agreed upon criteria, but the fact of the matter is that there is an incredible degree of distrust, growing hatred, outright animus between Sunnis and Shia in Iraq, and a great degree of violence. You have hundreds of thousands of Sunnis who have fled. You have large numbers of Shiites who have moved also either within Iraq. In cases of Sunnis, many of them have gone to Jordan and to Syria. And somebody like they could perhaps better answer this, but it is certainly my perception from my discussions with Iraqis that they fear, ordinary Iraqis fear sectarian violence far more than they fear the sort of the collateral damage from attacks on coalition forces. I mean, that is the dominant concern of Iraqis today.
Sorry, on the oil question, where is the money going? It's just being smuggled out of the U.S.?
Smuggled? No, I don't think it's, you know, there's any great U.S. conspiracy here. I think that it's criminal syndicates. It's going to, you know, a lot of what we can sort of like to easily describe as kind of religious extremism or you know, insurgency. In many cases, it just has to do with plain criminal behavior. And I think that for instance, down in Basra, yes, while you have a great number of sort of Shiite religious parties that are exerting their influence, you also just have criminal gangs, sort of mafia-type elements that predominate there. And so you know, a lot of that just goes into funneling the continuation of criminal enterprise. And that is sort of going off there, or it's going off to offshore bank accounts. A lot of it winding up in Dubai, Amman, and Damascus.
Not in George Galloway's hands these days, though. Yeah. But let's you've already teed him up. Let's bring in Gabe from The Guardian here. Let's talk about this issue of civil war, because when I was last there just 6 weeks ago, many people you spoke to painted a horrific picture of what is to come. We've talked about what has been, what is to come. What's your perspective as an Iraqi, as someone an expert in this field, someone who has very, very close links now and all through these periods? What's your perspective on this issue of civil war and how much worse it can get? You were a pessimist last time I spoke to you. I'm wondering if you've become more optimistic.
Yeah, I've changed my mind. It's all going well.
Excellent.
30,000 troops. Hallelujah. But I think it's a civil war because, as Rajiv was saying, it's the distrust, it's the hatred, it's the fear amongst every single Iraqi I talk to from those people coming from the next neighborhood. I mean, we go back to the same thing we said in 2003. It was impossible to identify neighborhoods in Baghdad, Sunni or Shia. At this moment, we can draw a sectarian map of Baghdad to every single street. And for the Sunnis I talk to, the insurgents or not the insurgents, yes, they do attack the Americans, but they are there's more fear and hatred towards the Shia militias than towards the Americans. The people are congregating kind of in groups and in neighborhoods, moving from one area to the other. Baghdad has become predominantly a Shia city, what was mixed at one point. The belt around Baghdad has become almost totally Sunni, while it had some Shia villages. And then this is on the bigger scale. On the smaller scale, like when
so what you're suggesting is a kind of Bosnian-style cantonization of ethnicity.
Yes, and we had this long argument today, me and
that's not good.
This morning, is it, should we? I don't know. Should this cantonization become like an official policy? And okay, you're in sector 1 and B, but again, we go back to the Iraqis. Once they hate each other and like different groups and different sects, and they're fighting each other. You tell them you want to like a Shia state, and say no, we love each other. We're all Iraqis. We don't have a problem. This is all kind of Zionist plot, blah blah blah. So it's really kind of complicated. But on the street level, so apart from then the political, the power grab, the militias fighting each other and everything, you have the economy. It's the most booming business in Baghdad these days to be part of a militia attacking another sect, because you take their houses, you take over their property, you kidnap them, you take ransom money. So it's a booming business, and it's very well you can do it. You can get the money, it's nice, but when you get the money and you say, oh, it's blessed by Imam Hussein or Omar or Bakr or anyone, it will be more convenient, and you have more power out of that. So is it civil war? Yes, it is civil war. I mean, then compare how many Iraqis are dying out of sectarian violence compared to how many Americans are dying out of this so-called like resistance or whatever.
Okay, good. I want to bring another expert.
You should
voice.
focus on the good news. Unemployment is down.
I want to bring another expert voice, only because I haven't had a conversation with her for several years. Caroline Hawley of the BBC. You spent several years of your life in Baghdad. In fact, some of them were with Rajiv. You even got a credit in the book. I don't know if you realise that, but you have.
I'm about to read it.
There you go. You have to, really. So, civil war. You now have a perspective on this. You've now left the city. You're not reporting day to day as you were for many months. We all remember seeing you doing thousands of lives about the modern tragedy that's Iraq. What's your perspective now, having left, looking at the future? This question of civil war and the future. What's your perspective?
mean, I have thought it was a civil war for quite some time. I left in December 2005, and already there was sectarian cleansing of neighbourhoods, and you can argue about the semantics, but I think it has been a civil war for quite some time. I think the future, I hope I'm wrong, but the thing that worries me most about the future is the mass exodus of funds and brains, the doctors, the teachers that are all leaving. And I remember clearly interviewing a doctor in the Iraqi passport office, and this was sometime in 2005, and he literally had tears in his eyes, and he said, Iraq is a great country, but I can't stay here anymore. And that is happening on a colossal scale, and I think that is catastrophic for Iraq.
Okay, now let me see if I can...
Can I just amplify that? Caroline's point, I think, is an excellent one. I mean, the very people you need to rebuild Iraq, the educated, more secular-leaning, urban, middle class and upper middle class people, they're the ones who have the resources to beat down the doors to the exit. They're the ones who are leaving. And you're left with a population that is unfortunately less educated and far more radicalized. It's not the sort of ingredients that will lead to the development of a stable, secular nation.
Let's try and create some division within the BBC, which is what we at Sky always like to try and do. let's hand the microphone to Paul Wood, who's the BBC's defence correspondent. Paul has just returned from Baghdad. But, Paul, what do you think? Civil war, not civil war, future, bad, awful, terrible,
It's
disastrous?
a cunning plan. This is obviously why you're head of foreign news at Sky, because we don't officially call it a civil war, because the national elites have not, in the way that Bosnia occurred, declared it to be one. Obviously, it is an undeclared civil war. And one of the stories I liked on my recent trip to Baghdad is an example of the way American good intentions of founders have founded is the reopening of Abu Nawas Street, which is the area along the riverside. The American Corps commander, General Corelli, thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if people could stroll along the riverside, enjoying the air, going to the restaurants. So he said, let's reopen it. This is now being backed by the Shiite leadership, essentially so that the Mahdi army can get easy access between the two main bridges which link Sunni areas, thereby to ethnically cleanse them all the more easily. And the Shiite ministers in the government, who have no interest in seeing these restaurants reopen, they thought they were used by a load of Ba'athist thugs in the past, are going along with it so that the Mahdi army can do this. So Shiite leadership believes that whoever controls Baghdad controls the country, and what is happening is a systematic attempt to drive out the Sunnis. I have one question for Rajiv on this. Do you credit the story that President Bush, before the invasion, did not know the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims?
This is a story that was at one point told by Kanan Makia, who a noted Iraqi exile who wrote A Republic of Fear and a professor at Brandeis University. And he was quoted as telling some people that in a meeting with the president, and this would have been probably in January, February of 2003, after a sort of a lengthy meeting in the Oval Office with a group of Iraqi exiles, as they were leaving, Bush turns to Kanan and says, so tell me again, who are the Sunnis and who are the Shiites? Now, I've subsequently asked Kanan about this, and he's been very cagey, and I can't quite determine whether he just doesn't want to be sort of back on the record saying this, or whether this is sort of exploded into some form of greater urban myth. So I'm sorry I can't clearly confirm it, but that's what I know.
I wouldn't put money against it, I don't think. Let's take another question. Yes, at the back. I can just see a hand. I can't see anything attached to the hand, but the hand, please.
Hi, Rajiv. First of all, let me congratulate you on your wedding. So I think that's
thank you.
Overdue. I have a question that I'd like your comment. I'd like your thoughts and comments on something that hasn't been touched on. Is to what extent, what's the extent of Iran's influence, not just in the existing local Iraqi government, but also amongst the militias, etc., because it's coming up more and more. The U.S. is trying to deflect blame to the others across the border, to the insurgency, etc. I just would like to get your thoughts on that.
I think Iran's influence is fairly significant across a wide range of Shiite militia groups and Shiite political parties. Iran has long been associated with the largest Shiite party, Skiri, or now it's under a new name, but formerly, the party formerly known as the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which operated for many years in exile in Iran. Its militia, the Badr Corps, is riddled with Iranian operatives, has long received Iranian funding material, as is Maliki's Dawa party. They also have extensive ties to Iran, different parts of the Iranian government. What's interesting to note is in the early days, Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army tried to fashion itself as really an Iraqi nationalist outfit. Sadr himself mocked Ayatollah Sistani for speaking Persian accented Arabic, and Sadr's folks were they were the Iraqi Shia. Well, of late, it's clear that Sadr has been receiving significant amounts of help from Iran, and in fact, Sadr was hanging out in Iran of late. Some of this reflects desperation, I think, on the part of Sadr, but it also speaks to just how brilliantly the Iranians have managed to co-opt Sadr. I mean, Iran is basically accomplishing its broader strategic objectives in Iraq. It's the one country that has sort of stood to gain the most out of this whole thing. Is Iran, as involved as some American officials might like to think it is in terms of the supplying of munitions and other things? I'm not so sure it's as big of a deal, but I certainly think that Iranian tentacles are all over Shia-dominated Iraq, from Baghdad down south to Basra.
Okay, good. Next. Yes.
My name is Haidar Safi. I'm an Iraqi journalist. I want to have a comment and also I have a question at the same time. About the, you highlight the point about the dissolving of the old army, and you put the whole thing in a way it's a money thing. You didn't highlight the, let's say, the national feeling of this army, and especially they enjoyed for decades the authority being or having sort of authority during Saddam and the previous regime. That's what I wanted to. And also why, let's say, most of the films, documentaries, or even the news is like a kind of shy documentaries. They don't say much about the new dictatorship in Iraq now, which replaced the former dictatorship of Saddam. Like yesterday, I think everybody watched the documentary or the news about that orphanage and the young orphans. And always like there is, because the government is weak or because of the government cannot operate and because of the, like they are, yeah, there's a justification for this government.
Can I just clarify, it's an important point, can I just clarify what you mean exactly by the new dictatorship? Are you talking about Maliki's government or are you talking about...
Maliki's government,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to...
Well, I want to just pick up on that for a second. I don't want to sort of make a characterization of the Maliki government, but one thing that greatly concerns me, and I think it's an appropriate subject to raise in a venue for journalists, is the steps that the Maliki government has taken of late to restrict reporting in Iraq, and I think that is thoroughly undemocratic. These orders saying that the aftermath of car bombings and other attacks cannot be filmed by journalists. I mean, Iraq on its books has perhaps the most progressive constitution in the Arab world, guaranteeing the greatest degree of civil liberties and personal rights. Yet in actual practice, the Maliki government has really retrenched in many respects, and I think that its attacks on the freedom of the press are unconscionable. And both the U.S. government and the British government have essentially allowed a lot of this stuff to take place without more stridently objecting. But I suppose, yet again, it's sort of seen in the interest of these governments to really restrict some of these images. I mean, the fewer pictures of blown-up streets there are on television, perhaps the better for the White House and Number 10. But I think that in many ways the Maliki government has made decisions that are manifestly not in keeping with the spirit of the democratization of Iraq.
I always remember that in Saddam's days you were banned from filming donkeys and shoeshine boys.
Exactly. There was
because it gave a very bad impression of the country that it was poor. And what about a donkey sequence being thoroughly mucked up by a Ministry of Information minder, but that's a more worrying...
One of our post photographers was threatened with expulsion for shooting a shoeshine boy.
Yeah. Let me ask you, before we take the last few questions, about Gordon Brown. We're about to have a new Prime Minister in this country. And we're also, as that happens next month, Paul and others will correct me if I'm wrong, about to see the gradual withdrawal of British forces from the south of Iraq. They will be pulled back from the Basra Palace, where they have about 500 troops next month. And one expects here that there will be further withdrawals as we go into the autumn and in the winter. How do you think that will play in Washington? As an irrelevance, as a change that Blair is no longer there, that the ally across the Atlantic is perhaps not what it once was? Will it have any effect at all on US policy, or is it pretty much a sideshow?
I hate to sort of disappoint the British audience, but I really do think it's kind of a non-event. I mean, yes, it was something that got a little bit of attention in America, but you know, all along, you know, the U.S. government has made a big deal of the British troop contribution when it's tried to perpetuate this fiction that this is really a broad coalition of nations. But despite the commitment that the United Kingdom has made and the sacrifices that this nation has made, you know, you guys have always been seen by the White House as those sort of a junior partner. I mean, just a story about, I can't remember if this particular one's in the book or not, about how the Brits were viewed by Bremer and company. I mean, you guys sent, Tony Blair sent Sir Jeremy Greenstock to be his special representative in Baghdad, an eminent statesman. You know, Greenstock was sort of treated as, you know, the junior nephew there, even though he had an office in the same suite as Bremer did. When George Bush made his surprise visit to Baghdad Airport, Thanksgiving Day, 2003.
I remember the pictures of the turkey.
Yeah, the fake turkey.
Yeah, the fake turkey.
Bremer and his top aides assembled at the airport. They invited key members of the Iraqi Governing Council. They invited members of the Baghdad City Council. Nobody told Sir Jeremy. Greenstock first heard about this when one of his staffers came into his office and said, Sir Jeremy, you might want to turn on the television. The American president is in Baghdad.
Well, we're put in our place by that anecdote. Okay, last few questions before we wrap up this evening. Yes, sir.
Another Baghdad veteran.
Hi, Rajiv. Do you think there was ever a moment when he was still in Baghdad that Bremer realized that there was an acknowledgement on his part that things had gone wrong or he'd done things wrong? And how is he perceived now in Washington?
Good questions. You know, I never was able to get from Bremer any sort of introspective assessment of his tenure. When I sat down with him for an extensive interview in June of 2004, just a few weeks before he was to depart, you know, I asked him whether things he would have done differently, and he was not at all expansive. He was very defensive, you know, then he subsequently wrote his book, in which he conceded no real mistakes. I mean, his one admission, which I think was even made subsequent to that in the New York Times op-ed, was that he made a mistake by giving authority to Ahmed Chalabi to implement de-Baathification, but he doesn't even acknowledge that the de-Baathification order itself was any sort of mistake. So he hasn't. But you know, that said, it's also become fashionable in some circles in Washington to blame Bremer for everything. And in fact, the people who seem to do this most in a whispered tone are his fellow Republicans, who are searching for people to hang this debacle on, and then sort of, you know, Bremer's out of government. He's not too close to the president, so he becomes a convenient whipping boy. And while I'm very critical of him in the book, you know, I want to be honest, and I don't think the guy deserves blame for everything under the sun. But there certainly is that sort of revisionist view in Washington. But you know, I would have expected somebody of Bremer's intellect to have at least been able to engage philosophically on what might have been done differently, and he didn't. It was really, shocking to me.
Okay, last question. Last question. Who wants the honour of the last question? Sir, your hand went up first.
As the Washington Post man in Baghdad, can you discuss the kinds of carrots and sticks that you may have encountered from the CPA in order to persuade you to see things through their rose-colored glasses?
Good question. There was always, there were far more sticks than carrots, although, the carrots involved, being told, you can come on this trip with Bremer, or you can go and do this and that. Access was the carrot and the stick. And, Dan Senor's Strategic Communications Office controlled where you could go, what you could do when it came to working with the CPA and getting access to things. And so, there were reporters, myself included, had to tread a fine line, because if you sort of went firing with your full clip of ammunition, you'd be frozen out from things, and you wouldn't get the leaks that they wanted to give, or the interviews that you hoped to line up. I've overheard conversations in their strategic communication office where reporters were deemed to be sufficiently unsupportive of the coalition effort, or overly negative, and their requests for interviews would just get tossed aside. And certain outfits, Geraldo Rivera got great access when he came to Baghdad. They picked their favorites. They gave them good access, and others, at the Post and at the New York Times, they realized the influence of those papers. So I got perhaps a little bit more latitude than others. But I mean, if you were from a smaller American newspaper or other outlet, and you started writing things that they didn't like, that was it. You'd be completely frozen out. The press office there operated like a little mini White House. And maybe one last point to make before we close out. People have asked me, why? You've got all these sort of shocking revelations in the book. Why didn't you publish these at the time? And the simple answer to that is, I didn't know them at the time, because the CPA was run like this little mini White House. As a reporter, you couldn't go and just troll the halls of the palace without a minder, or minder is the term from the old days. They called them escorts, but in many ways, those of us who had reported there, like Caroline, from the old days, we recognized the little echoes. We sat around for hours in the press office in the information ministry before the invasion. Afterwards, you'd sit around for hours waiting for Dan Senor to call you back to say that you could talk to this functionary, and they'd have somebody escort you in to see them. So to really observe the dysfunction of the Green Zone, that was very, very difficult. In many cases, and Americans who worked for the CPA were told in no uncertain terms that if they spoke to reporters without a palace minder present, they'd be kicked out of the, sent back on the next C-130. In many cases, it wasn't until a lot of the people who worked for the CPA returned back home to America. These people who went there as true believers, in many cases returned as true believers, became increasingly disillusioned with the way things had developed. But back kind of free from any threat of retribution. It was then that they were willing to open up, and in the course of 3-4 hour long interviews, finally after the second or third hour, they said, look, you want to know what really happened? And then they started to tell me these stories. And it wasn't until then that I really started to develop a fuller picture of what occurred inside the Green Zone.
Rajiv Chandrasekaran, those stories are all in those books over there. I'm not sure we've got enough copies. I'm sure they're going to go like hotcakes. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. Thank you.